so much. Hello. I am an architect. I think at a celebration like this, I should clarify I'm not a computer architect or a software architect or virtual architect. I'm actually an architect, whatever that is. So we deal with physical things like glass and steel and masonry, as well as the metaphors that those things represent. When you work in a field that's very complex, whether it is software engineering or actual architectural engineering, there are a great many stereotypes about what it is that we do. It's hard to sort of capture it in a simple sentence. So probably if you've seen some movies, the architect is the person who has a very sexy tie and a nice scarf and drinks red wine and makes a few sketches on some napkins, and then suddenly there's an amazing building. Everybody enjoys it. Of course, these stereotypes are sort of fun, and they're somewhat true, but they're not necessarily entirely true. So many of the different ways we understand such a complex profession as architecture or even software engineering is to imagine that all we're doing is creating things. We make things. So we make these kinds of things, or we make those kinds of things, or these things that we're here in. But the truth is, we don't really make things, because the things that are created by the process that we're involved in are simply representations of what it means to be human, what it means to do the things that we do, and why do we do these things as often or as less often as we seem to encounter in our daily lives. So we ask ourselves many, many questions as we create these things. Why are we here? The kinds of questions that a child might ask. A great question, especially a question that comes from a child, has no easy answer. It's just a kind of endless question. It's a question that leads to another question. Because, of course, the greatest questions are those that don't have an answer, that we must explore the meanings of the very foundation of what that expression or interrogation was about. In many ways, I sometimes say that how can you know the right answer if you haven't asked the right question? It's seemingly impossible unless you're running with luck. So we spend a great deal of time in our work trying to understand various questions, various interrogations, trying to even define the word concept. What is a concept, really? If you ask every person in this audience to define that word, they would likely have a slightly different variation of what it means, but we use it all the time, concept. For us, a concept is a question, and we use those questions to move our way through those things that we create. Because human nature is very hard to define. Nature seems like we understand it, and human nature seems like it's under control because it's who we are. But I often say that it's almost impossible to deal with nature unless you're able to manage human nature. And as we look around at the world around us, especially today, it's very easy to see that human nature is completely out of control. So how do we bring these two worlds together? Many people think that architecture is just a sort of a sculptural expression of things. And of course, the formal things, the formal objects that we create are very, very important. They're the sort of sex of what we do. They're the kind of great fun part that looks good from different angles and different lights. But actually underneath all of that, we have to ask ourselves, what is all of this stuff that we make? I sometimes say that we as humans are self-domesticating creatures. We domesticate other creatures like cows or sheep and so on. They were perfectly fine out there in the wilderness before we came along, but we said, hey, cows, come on into our life. We'll give you some food, but you have to live in this little surroundings, a little kind of corral or something like that. So we've domesticated those creatures, not necessarily against their will, but beyond what their ordinary circumstances would be had we left them alone. As humans, we domesticate ourselves. Nobody's come along and told us to do all this stuff that we're doing to ourselves. We do it sort of out of instinct. So if you try to understand what that really means, think about, say, a cage at the zoo. If you've gone to the zoo and you've seen the polar bear cage. A polar bear in a badly designed cage will pace back and forth. It has a great deal of anxiety. It self-inflicts wounds. It's very aggressive to anything that gets nearby because its living conditions are inappropriate for its basic nature. If you look at a good or well-designed cage, at least there's some degree of comfort, some degree of understanding where they are, and the bear will live a reasonably good existence. Well, we are making our own little polar bear cage. So all of us, everything that we do is a kind of capturing of our lives, putting it in order because civilization is so important to us. But if we design the wrong kind of cage, we're going to get aggressive, we're going to get anxious, we're going to lick ourselves till we bleed, we're going to do all kinds of strange things. And to a certain extent, I think that may be happening today. When I read that something terrible has happened in the world, or I see a picture of someone fighting or protesters hating each other's guts, we always very quickly say, well, it's someone else's fault. It's either those protesters' fault, or it's the politicians' fault, or it's the crazy people somewhere, maybe the media, it's their fault. It's everybody's fault but our own fault. And as an architect and as a designer, I thought, well, maybe we're not so innocent after all, because every one of those images that I've ever seen of people in conflict with one another is within the space that we as designers have created. We've designed the cage. So somehow we have to find out what that means. We need to understand how to design for people in a way that isn't just about objects. It's about the relationships between ourselves and those objects, the relationship between things. Many years ago, I was in China, and I speak a little bit of sort of very broken Chinese, and I asked a fruit salesman on the street if I could have 3 oranges. It was a little small stand. And the fruit salesman looked at me, and he said, yes, of course, 3 oranges. And I thought, oh, I must have said it wrong. He's holding up 4 fingers. So I said it again very slowly, and he said, yes, 3 oranges, 1, 2, 3. He counted the space between his fingers rather than his fingers. And we're so trained to think that there's only value in things that it's very hard for us to understand that there's value between things, just as much as the value of those things themselves. So the little Chinese fruit salesman sort of warped my head upside down, and I went, wow, that was amazing. 20 years of schooling, and I couldn't have gotten to that myself. I had to get it from the fruit salesman. But of course, architecture is a very slow profession, so we learn things slowly sometimes. It can take years or decades to finish some of these structures. And so we spend a great deal of time trying to understand them in different ways. By the way, I say architecture is the slowest profession. That's very different than the oldest profession, which is maybe sometimes what we're also referred to. We'll see. But certainly in this little story, one can start to understand that as we move around the world, we need to find ways to sort of help people, to support people, to understand that diversity is very important to us, that different kinds of spaces for different kinds of people provide different meanings. I've learned over the years, and in our office we've learned, that you can't tell people what to do. As soon as you tell people what to do, a great percentage of them are going to say, nope, that's not the way I want to do it. I want to do it my way. Even if originally their way was the way you told them to do it. It's just a kind of natural reaction. You can't engineer society. You can't engineer human life. We've thought that for many, many years. We've thought that, well, if we come up with the best possible theory, the kind of string theory of architecture, that will make everybody live in the right way. They'll all live in the best way. Everything will be lined up. The walls will be where they need to be. The ceiling will be where it needs to be. The floor materials will be what they need to be so that everybody will sort of feel like they're in a place they understand. But of course, humans are irrational as much as they are rational. So we have to recognize that many of the things we do just don't make sense. So you have to let that space grow. And that's an important part of understanding how to deal with people. It's very exciting to be here presenting on behalf of SLAC as this closing lecture, because the notion of interaction, some people call collaboration, is very important to us. We actually don't use the word collaboration very much. we use the word transdisciplinary or interaction. Transdisciplinary is where people don't just represent their own specific way of thinking or their own discipline or their own studies. They sit in the shoes of other people. In our office, an architect can be a landscape architect, or an interior designer can work with landscape architecture. So everybody's kind of moving around. And this is, I think, a positive way to see how we can interact. So in conclusion, I would like to say, especially at this important time, politically in the world around us, we all have to find a way in our own professions to look forward to a way of creating interaction between people, a way that supports various opinions, a way that allows for the basic human psyche to grow. We should never underestimate the power of intuition in balance with the power of predictability that we so much yearn for. So I spend a great deal of time looking at people in the work that I do. And I would also say that many of us, depending on what we work on, even if it's in the virtual world, just spending time looking at people and seeing how they interact with the things you make can help you provide a more supportive platform to interact positively in the future. So thank you very much.